So this is the last of the staff notes. We looked at the first one, which was on economic principles for adaptation to be made into fiscal, part of the fiscal planning, and then we looked at macro fiscal issues arising from this adaptation being part of the fiscal planning. Now the last one is about planning and mainstreaming adaptation to climate change in fiscal policy. So this is much more about how one would go about including adaptation as part of the fiscal policy in terms of planning and mainstreaming. Obviously, adaptation is a new thing, and as we said, it's very region specific. So even if a particular country like India, with its very diverse climate regimes, climate impacts being very different in each of these sub-regions of India, how do you plan adaptation and how do you allocate resources? We talked about moving resources from one from the center to one location, which may, essentially take it away from another region, because it's often a zero-sum game when you have a developing country like India with limited room for fiscal planning for adaptation, and then you have the regular development plans that have to happen as well. So let's continue and see what we mean by planning and mainstreaming adaptation to climate change in fiscal policy. So adaptation to climate change is an integral part of sustainable development and a necessity for advanced and developing economies alike. This is very clear now this summer, because there are floods from US to Japan, heat waves cooking China and cooked India earlier. India has had some heat waves and extreme rainfall events happening simultaneously in the same state like Himachal Pradesh. So it's a real mess all around the world in terms of extremes. So there is no difference in developing economies or advanced economies in terms of the necessity for adaptation to climate change. How can adaptation be planned for and mainstreamed into fiscal policy? This is a question we will look at here. Setting up inclusive coordination mechanisms and strengthening legal foundations to incorporate climate change can be a prerequisite. This note identifies 4 building blocks: taking stock of present and future climate risks, identifying knowledge and capacity gaps, and establishing guidance for next steps. Keeping always in mind that there are uncertainties in climate risks, but economic planning and fiscal policies have to plan for uncertainty in any case, even if there is no climate change. Developing adaptation solutions. This block can be guided by extending the IMF 3-pillar disaster resilience strategy to address changes in both extreme and average weather, and would cover the prevention of risks, alleviation of residual risks, and macro fiscal resilience. So we'll see a little bit more about this disaster resilience strategy in terms of the 3 pillars that IMF advises. Mainstreaming these solutions into government operations. This requires strengthening public financial management institutions by I didn't read that right at all, so let's start again. Mainstreaming these solutions into government operations. That's another building block here. This requires strengthening public financial management institutions by factoring climate risks and adaptation plans into budgets and macro frameworks, and in the management of public investment, assets, and liabilities. 4th block, providing for transparent evaluations to inform future plans. This involves continually monitoring progress and regularly updating adaptation plans. This is easier said than done, because some of the adaptations may be hard structures you put in place, even if it is for adapting to present risks and not even worrying about future risks, which we talked about in the previous section, previous staff note. So here it's not so easy to update adaptation plans in that sense in many cases. Okay, so that has to be kept in mind. Going into further detail, laying the groundwork, legal foundations, and adaptation planning. Adaptation to climate change is a necessity for advanced and developing economies alike. We already said this. Adaptation and mitigation are both needed to help reduce damages from climate change. Without strong mitigation, it's not possible to stabilize global temperature, and adaptation would become either impossible or too expensive. And we have already talked about how delaying action or building new things with adaptation to climate risks versus retrofitting existing structures, how it all adds up in terms of cost, and how delaying action actually will keep increasing costs. But many times we also mentioned that some countries are just struggling to deal with the disasters as they are happening now, with no room in the budget for planning adaptation to future risks. Some countries could consider strengthening institutions to effectively support climate adaptation when needed. So governments can start by creating or designating a coordination structure, allocating responsibilities, and establishing a process that to involve relevant stakeholders. Since adaptation is new and it tends to be very regional, local, and funding has to be, managed with international aid and so on. But the flow of information, responsibilities, and a process has to be in place, and adaptation has to happen as a co-development with stakeholders. Otherwise, stakeholders may not participate in the whole change needed in terms of sometimes their own behavior. Okay. National legal frameworks might need to be strengthened to provide the legal foundation for establishing adaptation processes and institutions, and for mandating adaptation planning. I won't read all these. As you can see, I'm just providing little snippets, picking what I think are important. Framework opted for standalone framework laws such as climate laws or climate adaptation. Sorry, I read it wrong again. Framework legislation can be useful for building a wide-ranging and coherent approach to climate adaptation. While statutory provisions vary widely, common areas of focus include information generation and sharing, adaptation planning, establishing institutional arrangements, and processes for managing and monitoring adaptation actions. Okay, so these are kind of the steps towards implementing those 4 building blocks for mainstreaming and planning adaptation into fiscal policy. Adaptation policies would benefit from being guided by plans that are articulated with other development plans. So it is very easy to see why politicians, for example, or decision makers would want to stress development and acknowledge climate change, but not necessarily follow up with decisions and actions for adaptation, especially in terms of fiscal policies and funding. So countries around the world, for example, are increasingly developing, adopting, and updating national adaptation plans, or NAPs, to guide their adaptation policies as required by Article 7 of the Paris Agreement. So all the signatories to the Paris Agreement have to have a national adaptation plan, and they have to have plans to update this as newer information on climate impacts becomes available. Adaptation plans can be organized around 4 essential blocks, which we'll see in a figure. So identifying climate vulnerabilities and adaptation gaps. So this is for adaptation plans to be organized. Seems obvious, and yet this includes stock taking and synthesizing information on climate change impacts and climate vulnerabilities. Computing climate vulnerabilities is not easy. Lots of data at relevant scales in space and time will be needed to estimate vulnerabilities using appropriate indicators that go into computing vulnerabilities. Identifying information gaps, capacity gaps, and weaknesses in terms of planning for adaptation. Developing a roadmap for the National Adaptation Plan process and its implementation. And fourthly, establishing guidance on normative principle for adaptation. So we'll look at, we have already looked at some of the normative principles, how we decide on helping the most vulnerable, increasing the income of the bottom of the society in terms of per capita GDP and so on. Those are not necessarily part of the cost benefit analysis, but those are normative principles on how we deal with society as a whole. Identifying adaptation solutions. Finding solutions starts with addressing information gaps by supporting, disseminating, and training on relevant climate adaptation data and concepts with all stakeholders. So every time you want adaptation, it affects people's lives and livelihoods, so you must include them at all the stages. Mainstreaming of adaptation in public financial management, PFM. This includes mainstreaming climate adaptation into national planning, so national development plans, sectoral plans and strategies, disaster risk management plans, spatial planning, building regulations, etc. Secondly, incorporating climate risk management and estimated adaptation needs in budget and financing plans, and enhancing implementation capacity. You can make all the plans and regulations, but implementation capacity has to be enhanced to achieve these goals of mainstreaming adaptation in public financial management. Monitoring, evaluation, and reporting. MER is very big part of Paris Agreement as well, in terms of the nationally determined contributions that countries have submitted. Many have revised them because their original submissions were considered not sufficient to meet the global warming targets and so on. So this involves continually monitoring progress made, reevaluating adaptation plans, and regularly updating those plans through NAP framework. Okay. As more information about climate change and technical solutions become available, NAPs will have to be updated and improved. So let's look at this in terms of global progress towards national adaptation plans. What are we looking at? Basically, progress toward the publication of a full-fledged national adaptation plan is assessed according to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change guidelines. The guidelines are articulated around the four main blocks, which are themselves divided further into a total of 23 measures, which you can read up. I'm not going to go into that. A country is considered to have taken a step if any of the detailed measures underpinning a block has been completed out of these four blocks. Light orange indicates countries for which the information collected was not sufficient to reach a conclusion on progress towards the publication of a full-fledged NAP, but they have an adaptation law, strategy, or policy in place according to UN Environmental Program. Gray denotes countries for which information collected was not sufficient to reach a conclusion in this way. So published NAPs for all these countries, you can see Nepal has one, Sri Lanka has one, some African countries here, and of course all the rich countries, and also some South American countries. But the large part of the global south here is in 1, 2, 3, 4 progress towards NAP, and there are others like orange here, which, as we said, the data was not enough to say if the NAP was ready, but they have an adaptation law, strategy, or policy. In any case, the main thing is that UNFCCC has engaged almost the entire world to participate, but there are some rich countries like Saudi Arabia, which is for whatever reason not part of this. And this is Egypt. This must be some other country like Libya, I suspect. So you can look it up. The adaptation plan structure, how would it work? So you have legal framework, coordination structure, and stakeholder inclusion that are considered necessary. Then, since this loop is going around, we can start anywhere. Identifying climate vulnerabilities and adaptation gaps, as we already said. Identifying adaptation solutions. Mainstreaming of adaptation in terms of fiscal policies being considered here. Monitoring, evaluation, and reporting so that the national adaptation plan is monitored and updated along the way. Okay, so we'll come back and look at adaptation solutions and look at the pillars that IMF has put forth for natural disasters that we mentioned briefly before. So we'll come back and do that in the next podcast. Okay.